My name is Madeline Carter, and I am 35 years old. For 12 years, my name was erased from family reunions, holiday tables, and the milestones that once defined who I was. Thanksgiving dinners without my chair, Christmas mornings without my name on a single gift, even my own sister's wedding where I was nothing but an empty space in the photographs. They treated me like I had died, easier to forget than to love. And yet after all those years of silence, when I built an empire with my own hands and found peace in the quiet halls of my Dallas mansion, the same family who cast me out appeared at my door, their faces heavy with desperation, as if the past had never existed. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. I can still see the old house in Detroit where it all used to happen. The big wooden table groaning under platters of turkey and mashed potatoes, the smell of pumpkin pie drifting from the kitchen. My relatives leaning back in their chairs, glasses raised in toasts, laughter echoing off the walls. There was always a fire crackling in the living room, cousins chasing each other down the hall, uncles arguing about football. And in every photograph from those nights, every smiling face was there. Except mine. Cut to me in my tiny apartment back then. A cardboard box doubling as a dining table, a plastic fork digging into lukewarm takeout Chinese food. The silence was so thick I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the drip of a leaky faucet. No clinking glasses, no chatter, no warmth. Just me chewing alone, scrolling through Facebook photos of the people who had once been my world. They looked like a Norman Rockwell painting, and I looked like a mistake they'd edited out. It wasn't an accident. It was my father's decision. Robert Carter believed his word was law in our family, and when he said I no longer belonged, everyone else followed. My mother, Elaine, never spoke up against him. She would simply lower her eyes, press her lips together, and nod. Maybe she thought she was keeping the peace, but her silence was just another form of betrayal. The contrast ate at me. Their table was crowded and noisy, the kind of place where 100 small conversations tumbled over each other. My table was quiet, the light above it buzzing faintly, my meal eaten from a paper carton. I would stare at the pictures online. My sister Sophia holding up her engagement ring, my parents beaming behind her relatives crowding around, and wonder if I'd already died to them. Birthdays passed without a phone call. Christmas mornings went by without a single card. When Sophia graduated, they threw a party with banners and champagne. I didn't even know it was happening until weeks later when I saw the photos online. For 12 years, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just bruise you, it hollows you out. There were nights when I tried to rationalize it. Maybe if I had chosen a different career, maybe if I had been easier to raise, maybe if I had smiled more, they would have wanted me there. But every time I thought that way, I remembered the look in my father's eyes when he told me I wasn't welcome anymore. It wasn't disappointment. It was dismissal. He had already decided I wasn't worth the space at his table. I would sometimes dream about walking into one of those reunions. I'd imagine the room going quiet, forks pausing in midair, every head turning as I appeared in the doorway. In the dream, I'd sit down, carve myself a slice of turkey, and no one would dare stop me. But when I woke up, it was just me and the dim morning light in my apartment, the echo of their laughter still ringing in my ears. Year after year, the distance grew. The pain dulled, but it never left. It turned into something else. Resolve, maybe even fire. Because every closed door reminded me of what I didn't have, and every reminder pushed me to build a life where their approval didn't matter. Still, I can't pretend it didn't cut deep. The hardest part wasn't just being excluded. It was knowing that at every holiday, at every toast, they looked around the table and decided it was better without me. My chair had been scraped back, folded up, put away. My name wasn't spoken as if speaking it would summon shame. I vanished from their world, but I didn't vanish from mine. And 12 years later, when I had learned to live without them, when I had built a world entirely my own, the same family who had erased me from their lives found the audacity to come back. I disappeared in their eyes. But one day they stood at the gates of my Dallas mansion, ringing the bell as if nothing had happened. They erased me for 12 years, and then dared to show up on my doorstep. And that's where it all began again. I grew up on the east side of Detroit, in a working-class neighborhood where the houses leaned a little from years of Michigan winters, and the paint always seemed to peel faster than anyone could afford to fix it. Our place was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled permanently of grease and laundry soap. Money was tight, but the rules of our household weren't written in dollars. They were written in comparison, and the golden standard was my younger sister, Sophia. Sophia was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment she could string a sentence together, my father called her his pride and joy. "Sophia's the one who's going to make this family proud," Robert would announce to anyone who would listen, puffing his chest like he had personally molded her from clay. She got the bigger bedroom when she turned 12, the new bicycle at Christmas, the nicer clothes. I got the leftovers, the hand-me-downs, the cheap sneakers that pinched my toes after 2 months. I didn't fight it, not out loud. I retreated into sketchbooks. While Sophia danced at pep rallies in her cheerleading uniform, the whole gym chanting her name, I would sit cross-legged on the back porch sketching the houses in our block, adding windows where there were none, drawing porches wide enough to hold families who laughed together instead of tearing each other apart. My father would find me bent over those drawings and sneer. "Daydreamer." He'd call me, shaking his head. "Do you think doodling on paper is going to put food on the table? You'll never be anything with that nonsense." His words stung worse than any punishment. They turned every line of pencil into proof that I was wasting my time. At family reunions, the contrast only grew sharper. We'd pack into my grandmother's house, the smell of pot roast filling every corner, kids running wild, while the adults drank beer and swapped stories. When conversation turned to achievements, the spotlight was always on Sophia. She got straight A's again. My father would beam, lifting his glass. Head cheerleader, scholarship potential. She's going places. And then, inevitably, someone would turn to me. One year it was Uncle Henry, half drunk, his voice carrying over the table. "If it weren't for Sophia," he said with a laugh, "this family wouldn't have anything to brag about." The table erupted in laughter forks, clinking shoulders, shaking. I sat frozen, my cheeks burning so hot I could feel tears threatening. I wanted to disappear into the floor. I glanced at my mother, hoping she would say something, anything. But Elaine just sighed, shaking her head softly. "You should be more like your sister Maddie," she murmured. That was her version of comfort. I dropped my gaze to my plate, pushing food around so no one would notice my hands trembling. Inside, a voice screamed that it wasn't fair, that I was more than their comparisons, but I never let it out. I swallowed it down with every bite of dry roast beef, with every awkward silence that followed. Another jab. That night, when everyone else was laughing in the living room, I slipped away to the porch and pulled my sketchbook from my bag. I drew until my pencil smudged black across my palms, until I could imagine walls strong enough to hold me, a roof that wouldn't cave no matter how heavy the weight pressing down. The older we got, the worse it became. Sophia was showered with attention. Rides to practice new outfits for dances, expensive tutoring sessions. When I asked for supplies for art class, Robert barked, "What's the point? You'll never make a dime off that garbage." My mother offered no protest. She just pursed her lips and told me not to argue. One evening when I was 17, the whole extended family gathered again. The room buzzed with voices, the air thick with cigarette smoke and pride. Sophia had just been voted captain of her cheerleading squad, and everyone was falling over themselves to congratulate her. My father stood at the head of the table, grinning like a man who had won a trophy himself. Then his eyes landed on me. And this one, he said, pointing straight at me, his tone slicing through the chatter as the family's failed experiment. The room went silent for half a beat. Then laughter spilled out, loud and merciless. My uncle slapped the table. My cousins smirked. Even my mother's lips twitched as though she couldn't quite stop herself from smiling. I sat there, every nerve in my body on fire, my heart hammering so loud I thought they could hear it. I didn't cry, not in front of them. I clenched my jaw until it ached staring down at my plate. But inside, something cracked. That night, when I finally escaped to my room, I pressed the sketchbook against my chest, like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I stared at the ceiling until morning, replaying his words over and over. Failed experiment, until they etched themselves into me like a scar. It was then I understood the truth that would shape everything that followed. Love in my family wasn't unconditional. It was transactional. It was earned only by becoming the shining example, the success story, the one they could parade in front of neighbors. Sophia had been chosen, and I had been discarded. And from that night on, I knew I would have to find another way to exist, a way that didn't rely on their approval. Because if I didn't, their laughter would devour me whole. In 2010, the banners went up for Sophia. There were balloons tied to the railing of our grandmother's porch, champagne, chilling in buckets of ice, and trays of catered food lined across the dining room. She had just earned a scholarship to a business school in Chicago, and my father announced it to the world like she'd been crowned queen. Neighbors stopped by with flowers, relatives clapped her on the back, and Sophia basked in it, smiling that polished smile she always knew how to flash when the spotlight hit her. I stood at the edge of the room, clutching a plate I didn't have the appetite to touch, and thought about how quiet it had been when I mailed off my own acceptance letter. Wayne State University, Detroit. Architecture. No champagne, no balloons, no speeches. Just a grunt from my father when I told him. Later that evening, when the last of the relatives had gone home, Robert cornered me in the kitchen. The smell of spilled wine lingered in the air, the counters sticky with cake frosting. He leaned against the counter, his voice sharp as broken glass. Architecture. You think drawing pretty houses will make you someone. You'll never make anything with those scraps of paper. You'll throw your future away chasing daydreams. I wanted to fight back, to tell him that I saw something in those sketches that he would never understand. That buildings were more than walls, that they could carry light safety dignity. But the words stuck in my throat. Elaine came in to gather plates, her eyes flicking between us. She didn't defend me. She just echoed softly. Maybe your father's right, Maddie. Maybe you should think of something more practical. Sophia drifted in, then her heels clicking on the linoleum, her cheeks still flushed from hours of praise. She smirked as she passed me, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Not everyone is cut out to be the star, she murmured, just loud enough for me to hear. My father chuckled, and my mother didn't say a word. The years that followed only widened the gap. At family dinners, Sophia's reports from Chicago were celebrated like she'd discovered gold. Professors loved her internships lined up for her. Meanwhile, I came home with blisters on my hands from carrying drafting supplies across campus, my head filled with models and floor plans. No one asked me what I was building. No one cared. By 2013, the tension had hardened into something unbearable. It was Easter weekend at my grandmother's house. The air smelled of ham and biscuits, the windows fogged with steam from the kitchen. I had just finished explaining to an aunt about a small community project I was helping with in Detroit, renovating an abandoned house for low-income families, when my father cut me off. "That's not real work," he barked across the table, his fork clattering onto his plate. The room went still. "You think patching up some rundown dump makes you an architect? You're wasting your time, and you're dragging this family's name through the mud. I'm tired of your foolishness." I stared at him, my throat tight. "Why does it matter to you so much what I do?" "It's my life." His face turned red veins, straining at his neck. "Your life reflects on this family, and you," he jabbed a finger in my direction, "are an embarrassment. From now on, you don't come to reunions. You don't sit at my table. You don't belong here until you prove yourself." Silence crashed over the room. Forks froze midair. Cousins stared at their plates. Sophia sat back, lips curled in satisfaction. Elaine's eyes darted toward me, then away. She said nothing. Not a single word in my defense. I felt the heat rise up my chest, shame and anger twisting into one. My chair screeched against the hardwood as I pushed it back. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I stood my legs trembling and looked at the faces around the table, faces that wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother's gaze lingered for a second, filled with something I wanted to call regret. But she turned her head, aligning herself with my father's decree. Without another word, I left. I walked through the living room past the photographs on the mantel, pictures of Sophia in her cheerleading uniform, Sophia at her prom, Sophia holding her acceptance letter. Not a single one of me, not even the school photo where I'd been forced to stand off to the side. The air outside was sharp and cold, the spring wind carrying the smell of wet pavement. I walked down the porch steps and across the cracked driveway, the laughter from inside resuming the moment the door closed behind me. That night, lying awake in my bed at my grandmother's house, I realized something had snapped. The bond between us wasn't fragile anymore. It was broken. My father's words weren't just an insult. They were a sentence, and my mother's silence sealed it. I understood then that I had been officially cut out, carved away from the picture they wanted to show the world. I was no longer the daughter who sat at the corner of the table with a sketchbook. I was the one they could erase without guilt. That was the night I stopped waiting for their approval. And that was the night I understood that whatever future I built, I would build it alone. Thanksgiving of 2014 came with the bitter chill of late November in Detroit. While most of the city seemed to pause, families gathering around tables heavy with food, I was pulling a double shift at a corner cafe downtown. The smell of burnt coffee and fried eggs clung to my clothes, and my hands ached from bussing tables. During a short break, I pulled my phone from my apron pocket. Facebook lit up with photos. My father carving the turkey, my mother beaming behind a line of steaming dishes, Sophia laughing with cousins. Everyone was there, everyone except me, Bami Matais. I stared at the glowing screen until my eyes blurred. The captions were worse than the pictures. Another wonderful Carter Thanksgiving. So blessed to be with family. My own family smiling without me as if I had never existed. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned to refill a customer's coffee, swallowing the lump that had risen in my throat. Christmas 2015 was no better. My apartment by then was a drafty little unit above a laundromat, the radiators clanking through the night but never quite keeping the cold out. I dragged home a tiny artificial tree from a discount store, its plastic needles already shedding into the carpet. I wrapped dollar store lights around it, humming carols under my breath, trying to convince myself it was enough. I bought 2 small presents, wrapped them in newspaper, and wrote my own name on the tags just to feel what it was like to have something waiting for me. That night, I scrolled through more pictures. My parents and Sophia stood proudly by a massive Christmas tree, ornaments, glittering presents piled high around them. The captions read, "Family is everything." I stared at those words until they became meaningless shapes. If family was everything, then what did that make me? The hardest blow came in the summer of 2016. My phone buzzed with notifications as friends tagged me in photos from Sophia's wedding. She stood in a white gown, Robert walking her down the aisle, Elaine dabbing her eyes in the front row. My aunts and uncles cheered, cousins held bouquets. It was all there, a perfect tableau of unity. I hadn't even known it was happening. Not a phone call, not a card, not a whisper. Just the cold revelation through social media that my own sister had pledged her life to someone, and I hadn't even been considered worthy of a seat in the back row. I sat cross-legged on my apartment floor, phone in my hand, staring until the screen went dark. The silence in the room pressed down heavy on me. I pressed my palms against my eyes, willing the tears to stop, but they slid down anyway. The loneliness hollowed me out until there was nothing but the echo of their laughter and the distant music from someone else's wedding band. One evening, not long after I picked up the phone and called my mother, for a moment when her voice answered, something in me lifted. I thought maybe she would soften, maybe she would remember I was still her daughter. "Hi, Mom," I said quietly, my voice cracking. I just wanted to hear from you. It's been a while." There was a pause, a shuffling sound as if she was covering the receiver. Then her voice clipped cool. "Your father thinks you don't need to come around anymore. It's better this way." I tried to respond, but the words died in my throat. I lowered the phone, staring at the wall of my darkened apartment. Her voice echoed in my ears long after the call ended. That night I turned off all the lights and sat on the floor by the dim glow of the tiny plastic tree. My sketchbook lay open beside me, lines half finished, as if even the houses I used to dream of had abandoned me. I pressed my back against the wall, listening to the hum of traffic outside, and let the reality sink in. I wasn't just forgotten. I had been erased. And in that moment I realized the photograph of family that existed on their walls no longer had a space for me. I had been cut out cleanly, deliberately, like I'd never been part of it at all. In 2014, I packed everything I owned into the back of a rusted sedan and drove south. Detroit had become a graveyard of memories I couldn't bear to walk through anymore, so I chose Dallas. I didn't know a soul there, but that was the point. I wanted a place where my last name meant nothing, where no one would ask why I wasn't at Thanksgiving or why my sister's wedding album didn't include me. The apartment I found was no bigger than a storage closet tucked above a laundromat, whose machines rattled all night long. The wallpaper was peeling, the carpet stained, and the bathroom sink leaked constantly, leaving a rust-colored ring in the basin. Still, it was mine. I stretched a thin mattress across the floor, stacked my sketchbooks along the wall, and told myself it was enough. To survive, I worked 2 jobs. Mornings were at a corner cafe, slinging burnt coffee and bagels to office workers in a hurry. Nights, I traded my apron for steel-toed boots, clocking in at construction sites where I carried lumber-swept sawdust and did whatever grunt work the foreman handed me. My body ached in ways I'd never known before, but I welcomed the pain. Every bruise, every blister on my hands was proof that I was no longer waiting for anyone to hand me a place at their table. I was building my own. It was at one of those sites that I met Colleen. She was a few years older than me, with sharp eyes and a laugh that cut through exhaustion like sunlight. We bonded over coffee breaks, talking about how much we hated being underestimated. She told me about her dream of designing interiors that actually felt like homes, not just boxes filled with furniture. I told her about the sketches I'd been making since I was a kid, houses that breathed light and warmth. By the end of that week, we were already plotting something bigger than paychecks and overtime. Our first project was a disaster waiting to happen. We pooled every cent we had, maxed out our credit cards, and bought a foreclosed house on the edge of Oak Cliff. The place sagged like it was tired of standing. The roof leaked in 5 different places, the floors bowed under our feet, and the air smelled like mold and despair. But to us it was a canvas. We worked until our bodies gave out. I spent days hammering shingles under the Texas sun, sweat stinging my eyes, tar sticking to my arms. Colleen tore up rotted carpet, her hands blistered and raw. We replaced beams, patched walls, hauled away truckloads of debris. At night, I'd collapse on the floor of my apartment, every muscle screaming, my palms so swollen I could barely hold a pencil, but I still sketched. Ideas for the kitchen layout, a porch that could catch evening light, a living room that felt like it could hold love. Money was always the enemy. Every trip to the hardware store meant another swipe of a credit card dangerously close to its limit. There were nights I couldn't sleep, running numbers in my head, wondering if we'd just dug our own graves under a collapsing roof. But Colleen would crack open a beer at midnight, hand it to me, and say, "We'll make it work. We always do." And somehow I believed her. When the last coat of paint dried and the last board was nailed into place, we held our breath and listed the house. It sold within weeks. Nothing fancy, nothing life-changing, but enough to pay off the cards and put a few thousand in our pockets. The day the deal closed, Colleen and I sat on the curb outside Greasy Pizza Box, between us 2 cans of cheap beer, sweating in the Texas heat. We laughed until our stomachs hurt, grease staining our hands, the exhaustion lifting off our shoulders for the first time in months. It wasn't just about the money, not for me. It was about standing in front of something that everyone else had called worthless and proving it could be beautiful. It was about proving I wasn't the failed experiment my father had named me. That night, lying on the thin mattress back in my apartment, I stared at the ceiling and whispered a promise into the dark. I would never again measure my worth by the space my family refused to give me. I would build my own table, my own house, my own name, and from that moment on, I swore I would never need Robert Carter's approval again. By 2017, Carter Development Group was finally finding its footing. Colleen and I had finished 3 successful flips, and we had just broken ground on our first new build, a modest 2-story home on the outskirts of Dallas. For the first time, I could almost breathe without the constant weight of numbers pressing down on me. But stability, I would learn, was fragile. The lawsuit came like a punch to the gut. A former partner, someone we had trusted early on, claimed we'd breached contract and owed him damages big enough to wipe us out. When the papers arrived, my hands shook so badly I dropped the envelope. Reading the words seeking dissolution of company assets made my chest seize. He wanted to bury us before we'd even begun. The days that followed blurred into panic. I sold my car, the one piece of stability I owned, and started riding buses and hitching rides to sites. I pawned the few nice things I had, a necklace from my grandmother, a decent watch I'd bought to look professional. At night, I'd sit at my kitchen table, staring at bills, running numbers, until tears blurred the ink. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my father's voice, sharp and merciless. "You're useless. You'll never make anything of yourself." Colleen tried to keep me anchored. "We'll fight this," she said, but I saw the worry in her eyes. We didn't have the money for a long court battle. The cards were stacked against us, and part of me thought maybe this was it. The moment Robert's prophecy came true. Then came Marcus Hill. He was a real estate attorney with a reputation for being stubborn in court, the kind of man who hated bullies. When I explained our situation, he leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and said, "You've been wronged. I can see that. And I'll take this case. But you have to be ready to fight like hell." I nodded, even as my stomach twisted. The weeks leading up to the hearing were some of the darkest of my life. Opposing counsel sent letters filled with threats demanding settlements we couldn't afford. Some nights I lay awake on my thin mattress, imagining headlines, "Young female developer, bankrupt after scam." The shame, the humiliation. I could see Robert's smug face, hear him laughing that I had proven him right all along. When the day came, I walked into the courthouse in the same black blazer I'd worn to job interviews years earlier, its seams stretched and shiny with wear. Colleen squeezed my shoulder before I stepped inside, whispering, "You've got this." But my palms were slick with sweat, my knees weak. Inside the courtroom was cool, the air heavy with formality. The man suing us sat across the aisle, smirking, his expensive suit gleaming in. When he caught my eye, he leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something that made them both laugh. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to look straight ahead. As the proceedings began, their attorney painted me as naive, unqualified a girl playing house with other people's money. "She's inexperienced," he told the judge, his tone dripping with disdain. "She's a dreamer pretending to be a developer. She signed agreements she didn't understand, and now she wants this court to excuse her failures." My nails dug into my palms until they nearly broke the skin. In that moment, Robert's words roared in my ears. Failed experiment, daydreamer, useless. I could feel the heat rising up my neck, threatening to drown me in shame. Then Marcus stood. His voice was calm, but carried steel. He laid out the facts: the partner had broken deadlines, withheld payments, and tried to force us into terms no fair-minded person would accept. He showed receipts, contracts, proof of every promise we had kept. When it was my turn to testify, my legs shook as I stood. I told the truth, that I had poured every ounce of myself into the work that I knew, every nail hammered, every wall painted, every late-night hour counted. "This company isn't just a business," I said, my voice trembling. "It's my life. I built it with nothing, and I won't let anyone steal it from me." The opposing lawyer sneered. "Miss Carter, don't you think you're a little out of your depth here? Isn't it true you're just a young girl with big dreams trying to play in a man's world?" The words sliced through me, echoing every dismissal I'd heard growing up. For a moment I faltered. Then I lifted my chin. Maybe I am young. Maybe I dream big. But every house I've touched has turned from rubble into a home. You can laugh at me, but you can't erase what I've built with my own hands. The courtroom went quiet. Hours later, after endless arguments, the judge finally delivered his ruling. He sided with us. The partner's claims were dismissed, his attempt to bankrupt us thrown out. My knees nearly buckled as the words sank in. Colleen gripped my arm, her face breaking into a grin. I didn't hear the rest of the judge's speech. All I heard was the rush of blood in my ears, the sudden release of a weight I had been carrying for years. Tears blurred my vision, and I didn't care who saw. For the first time, I realized I could survive without anyone's approval. Not my father's, not my mother's, not anyone's. As we walked out of that courtroom into the Texas sun, the air felt different, lighter. I was still shaking, but for once it wasn't from fear. It was from the knowledge that I had been tested and I hadn't broken. That was the day I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could build something no one could take from me. By 2018, Carter Development Group was more than just a name on a business card. It was a living thing growing fast and demanding more of me than I thought I could give. What had started with one broken-down house in Oak Cliff had become subdivisions on the outskirts of Dallas, neat rows of homes with wide porches and open kitchens, designed to feel warm, not sterile. People began to notice. Buyers lined up. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had carved out something solid. But with growth came a different kind of challenge. I was no longer just the woman with a hammer and a sketchbook. I was the one signing contracts, hiring crews, making deals with men twice my age who had been in construction longer than I'd been alive. And most of them didn't take me seriously. I'll never forget one meeting with a subcontractor. A man named Frank Heavyset, his hands scarred from years of work. He looked at the blueprints spread across the table, then at me, his lips twisting. "You're the boss," he asked like it was a punchline. "That's right," I said evenly. "I'm the founder of Carter Development." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Listen, sweetheart, this is a big job. You want these houses standing in 10 years, you're going to need someone who knows what he's doing. I can't sign off on this if you're calling the shots." Colleen shifted beside me. Her arms crossed, fire in her eyes. "She's the reason you're even looking at these blueprints, Frank. Either get on board or get out of the way." His laugh died when he saw I wasn't backing down. "Fine," he muttered, scribbling something on his papers. But I knew men like him were waiting for me to fail, ready to smirk when my dream crumbled. It wasn't just Frank. Time after time, I watched skepticism cloud the room when I walked in. Some wouldn't shake my hand. Others talked over me, directing questions to Marcus, our attorney, or even Colleen, assuming she was the one in charge. I'd sit there biting back the urge to scream, remembering the way my father had once sneered, "You'll never make anything with those scraps of paper." His voice lived in my head, but instead of crushing me, it pushed me forward. So I worked harder. I visited every site, walked every frame before the drywall went up, checked every invoice, every nail. I learned to speak their language, to call out mistakes before they became disasters. Slowly, grudgingly, some of them began to respect me. Not all, never all, but enough. By late 2019, we launched our first model home in a new subdivision. I remember the morning of the open house. The sun blazing down the grass, still damp from sprinklers, the scent of fresh paint clinging to the air. We opened the doors, and within hours, families streamed in. Kids ran through the hallways, couples whispered about where the Christmas tree would go. By the end of the week, every single lot was sold. Colleen and I stood in the empty living room after the last buyer left, exhausted and giddy. "They'll have to eat their words now," she said, kicking off her heels and collapsing onto the new carpet. I laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in a long time. The success rolled into the next year. More projects, bigger projects. My calendar filled with site visits, investor meetings, design revisions. Some nights I fell asleep with blueprints still spread across my lap, my mind buzzing with measurements and deadlines. But beneath the exhaustion was a current of pride that kept me going. Then one morning in 2020, I walked into the office and found a glossy magazine sitting on my desk. My face stared back at me from the cover. The headline read, "The New Face of Dallas Real Estate." For a moment I just stared. My hands trembled as I picked it up. There I was, no longer the girl hiding in the corner sketching houses while everyone else toasted Sophia. No longer the failure my father had written off. I was the story. I leaned back in my chair, flipping through the pages. Photographs of me at construction sites, hard hat on dirt, smeared across my jeans. Quotes about vision and persistence, about redefining what success looked like in a male-dominated industry. Every line felt like a counterpunch to the voices that had tried to silence me. Holding that magazine, I whispered to myself, they can't ignore me anymore. For the first time, I felt the echo of something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine in years. Not my father's approval, not even my family's recognition, but the knowledge that their dismissal no longer mattered. What I had built was undeniable. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Even after all the headlines, the sold-out homes, the magazine covers, a part of me still carried the ache of wanting to be seen by the people who had erased me. I told myself I didn't care anymore, that their approval meant nothing. But the truth was more complicated. Somewhere deep inside, the child in me still wished my parents would call, still wanted to be let back in. I remember 2016 like a wound that never closed. Word reached me that my mother was having heart surgery. I didn't hesitate. I drove 4 hours straight from Dallas to the hospital in Detroit, a bouquet of lilies on the seat beside me and an envelope of cash in my bag. I walked into the lobby, breathless, rehearsing what I might say to her when I finally saw her again. But at the front desk, the receptionist frowned at the screen and shook her head. "I'm sorry, Ms. Carter, but your father has signed a restricted visitors order. Only approved family members are allowed in." The words hit like ice water. "I am family," I insisted, gripping the counter, my voice cracked, desperate. "I'm her daughter." "I understand," the woman said gently. "But with HIPAA, we have to follow the instructions on file." I sat in the hallway for hours, clutching the flowers, until the petals began to bruise. Nurses passed by, casting me sympathetic looks, but no one could override the paperwork my father had signed. Finally, after nearly half a day, someone told me I could have 5 minutes. 5 minutes in a dim room with machines beeping steadily and my mother unconscious under a tangle of wires. I placed the bouquet on the table, slipped the envelope under her pillow, and whispered, "I'm still here, Mom, even if you don't want me." She never knew I had been there, or if she did, she never let on. I drove back that night in silence, the dashboard lights blurring as tears refused to stop. Years passed. I kept building project after project, but every so often I tried to reach across the chasm. In 2023, when I heard Lucas, my nephew Sophia's only child, was applying to college, I thought maybe I could help. I remembered being his age, dreaming of a chance that never came. Quietly, without telling anyone, I transferred money to cover part of his tuition deposit. It wasn't about recognition. It was about making sure he had a door open that had always been slammed in my face. 3 days later, the money came back. Attached was a message from my father. 8 words that cut sharper than any court battle, any insult shouted across a table. "We don't need money from you." No signature, no thank you, just rejection, neat and clean like the cut of a knife. I stared at that message until the screen dimmed, my chest tight, my throat raw. He hadn't said they didn't need the money. He'd said they didn't want it from me. That was the difference. It was never about the money. It was about making sure I stayed outside the gate no matter how much I had built, no matter how high I had climbed. That night I sat in my office, lights off, the city glowing faintly beyond the window. My fingers traced the grain of the mahogany desk I had bought when the company finally turned a profit. I should have felt proud. I should have felt untouchable. But all I felt was the weight of that message, the old familiar voice in my head whispering, I was still the outsider, still the failure they could not accept. I tried to remind myself of everything I had accomplished. The houses that now sheltered families, the scholarships that had put kids through trade school, the hospitals I had helped fund. All of it was real, undeniable. But to Robert, it meant nothing. To him, I was still the daughter not worth a chair at his table. I closed my eyes, letting the silence press in. The years of exclusion, the hospital hallway, the returned money. It all piled up until it crushed the air from my lungs. And in that silence, a clarity rose. I had knocked on the door too many times, hoping they might let me back in. I had offered peace money, time forgiveness, but they had locked it tight, thrown away the key, and barred the windows. I tried. I whispered into the empty office. I tried, and they didn't want me. The words hung in the air, final and sharp. And in that moment I understood with a certainty that burned through the old ache to them I had been erased a long time ago. I wasn't the daughter at the table or the sister in the photographs. I was the ghost they chose not to see. With them I had been dead for years. And with that truth, I finally let the weight of it settle to Robert, to Elaine, to Sophia. I would always be the girl cut out of the family picture. The one who never had a place at the table. The iron gates of my Dallas home glinted in the early sunlight, shadows stretching long across the driveway. The cameras whirred faintly as they scanned the property, but inside everything was still. The marble countertops in the kitchen reflected the golden glow spilling through the windows, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. I padded barefoot across the polished floors, letting the quiet soak into me. For once, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I had built this place from the calluses on my hands, from years of sweat, and nights when I thought I'd lose everything. Every pane of glass, every slab of stone, every light fixture chosen to remind me that nothing here had been given. I had created an empire out of the ashes they left me in, and for the first time I was at peace with the solitude. Carrying my coffee, I wandered into the living room. The floor-to-ceiling glass opened onto the infinity pool, the water shimmering like liquid silver. Beyond it, the city stretched skyscrapers catching the sun. I set the cup down on the walnut table, running my hand over its smooth surface. This, I whispered to myself, is mine. All of it. The sharp sound of the doorbell shattered the moment. I frowned, startled. Nobody came unannounced. Not here. My house was gated private, my number known only to a handful of people. The chime echoed again, insistent this time, pulling me toward the foyer. I tapped the screen on the security panel. The camera flickered on, and my breath caught in my throat. Robert. My father. Standing tall in his pressed shirt, though his shoulders hunched just slightly as if weighed down by something he couldn't name. Elaine was beside him, her purse clutched to her chest like a shield, eyes darting toward the ground. Sophia was there, too perfect as ever, but the smile she once wore like armor had cracked. Her hand clutched the arm of a man I recognized from photographs. Ethan, her new partner, his tie pulled tight, his jaw set, and behind them a few familiar faces from the old family gatherings, aunts and uncles who had laughed at my expense all those years ago. The sight of them froze me in place. 12 years of silence. 12 years of holidays spent alone, of milestones ignored, of phone calls unanswered. 12 years of being a ghost. And now suddenly here they were on my doorstep, framed by the camera, like actors in a scene they didn't belong to. My chest tightened, memories colliding. The hospital hallway where I had been turned away. The returned transfer for Lucas's tuition, my father's voice calling me a failed experiment. The shame, the anger, the grief I thought I had buried surged up like a wave. I stepped back from the screen, my coffee cooling in my hand, heart pounding. For a long moment I just stood there staring at the image frozen on the monitor, unable to move. The irony nearly made me laugh. They had erased me, so completely convinced themselves I no longer existed. Yet now, when their world must have cracked, they had found their way to mine. The chime rang again, long and sharp, reverberating through the empty house. I pressed my lips together, forcing my hands to stop shaking. My voice came out in a whisper, low and steady, though no one could hear it but me. 12 years of silence, I said, eyes fixed on their faces. And now you're standing at my door. I pulled the heavy brass handle and opened the door. The Texas sun spilled across their faces as they shifted uncomfortably on my porch. My voice was steady, the kind of calm that had taken me years to forge. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. They filed in slowly, their eyes darting around like tourists in a museum they couldn't afford. Robert's gaze swept the walnut floors, the chandelier above the glass walls opening onto the infinity pool. Elaine clutched her purse tighter, her shoes clicking nervously against the marble. Sophia's face was carefully composed, but her eyes betrayed a strain I hadn't seen before. Ethan tugged at his tie jaw clenched, pretending confidence he clearly didn't feel. My aunts and uncles lingered near the doorway, shifting awkwardly, trying not to gape too openly. I led them into the living room. The morning light poured across the leather sofas, the polished surfaces, the quiet elegance of a space I had designed to be a sanctuary. They sat stiffly, no one quite sure what to do with their hands. I poured coffee into white porcelain cups, the sound of liquid filling the silence. It was Robert who finally broke it. He cleared his throat, straightened his shoulders, and tried to summon the authority he'd once wielded over me like a weapon. "Madeline," he began, his tone even, but brittle families stick together in difficult times. "Sophia's going through a divorce. The legal fees, the settlement. It's been difficult. This is your chance to contribute to the family legacy, to show that we stand as one." I set the coffee pot down deliberately, the clink against the tray sharper than it needed to be. "Family legacy," I repeated softly, almost to myself. Sophia sat rigid on the edge of the couch, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. She didn't say a word. Ethan shifted closer to her, resting a hand possessively on her knee before leaning forward. His eyes met mine with a smug glint. "If you have money," he said flatly, "it's not really a choice. It's your obligation. Family isn't something you get to walk away from." A bitter laugh rose in my throat, but I kept it down. Elaine's hands twisted around her purse strap, her knuckles white. She still hadn't looked at me, not once, since stepping into my home. The silence stretched thick and heavy. I let it sit, savoring the discomfort the way their bravado shrank in the air I controlled. Finally, I looked directly at Robert. His eyes flickered just for a moment, betraying the desperation behind his mask. 12 years. I said, my voice low but steady. Not once was I invited to sit at your table. 12 years, you carved me out of every holiday, every wedding, every reunion. And now... I swept my gaze across them, taking in the perfect sister, the cowardly mother, the smug boyfriend. Now you sit in my living room asking for rescue. Robert shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, but no words came. Sophia's fingers dug into her knees, her shoulders pulled tight. Ethan opened his mouth as if to speak again, then thought better of it under the weight of my stare. Elaine blinked rapidly, her lips pressed into a thin line. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap, my heart pounding, but my face calm. The moment had arrived, the reckoning I had imagined 1,000 times, and for the first time in my life, I was not the one shrinking in shame. The room was silent, but for the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second landing like a verdict no one wanted to hear. The air in the room thickened until it felt hard to breathe. No one spoke. Robert's eyes darted to the floor, refusing to meet mine. Sophia's fingers knotted together, her nails digging so deep into her palms I wondered if she'd bleed. Elaine finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks as she tried to steady her trembling hands. I reached to the side table and picked up my tablet. My thumb swiped across the screen, the glow illuminating my face as I pulled up the numbers. "You want to know what I've been doing all these years?" I asked quietly. "What became of the daughter you cast out?" A bar graph filled the screen, bold lines climbing higher with each passing year. Carter Development Group. I continued tilting the tablet so they could see, is valued at $120 million today. That's 12 years of sweat, 12 years of pouring myself into work you all mocked me for. While you sat at family dinners laughing about my sketches, I was building this. Robert shifted uncomfortably. His jaw clenched tight. Sophia's face paled. Ethan coughed into his hand, but the sound came out brittle, betraying his unease. Elaine let out a quiet sob. I swiped again. This time the screen filled with photographs, a ribbon stretched across the entrance of a children's hospital, my hand gripping the scissors in the middle of a crowd. Beside it, letters of thanks from Dr. Rachel Nguyen, smiling staff members, children in bright gowns grinning from their new treatment rooms. When I had money to spend, I said, my voice cutting through the silence, I put it here. Into places that needed it. Into hope for families who had none. I didn't give it to people who turned their backs on me. I held the image there, forcing them to look. Sophia's lips trembled. Robert's face flushed crimson, his eyes locked on the floor as though it could swallow him whole. Ethan shifted, tugging at his tie like it was strangling him. Elaine covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Another swipe, another set of images. Rows of young men and women in trade uniforms, certificates in their hands, pride on their faces. Scholarships, I said firmly. Tools. Tuition uniforms for kids who wanted to work but had no means to start. Many of them work for me now. They didn't come asking for handouts. They came ready to build a future. And I gave them the chance no one ever gave me. The silence was suffocating. I could hear the tick of the wall clock behind me, each second landing like a verdict. I let it stretch until they squirmed. Finally, I leaned forward, setting the tablet down with a soft thud. My eyes swept across the room, pausing on each face. Robert's stubborn refusal to look at me. Elaine's shame written in every tear. Sophia's pride crumbling in her silence. Ethan's arrogance cracked wide open. This, I said, my voice steady, is where my money goes. To people who respect effort. To people who believe in me. Not to those who erased me for 12 years and suddenly remember I exist when they need a check. No one moved. No one dared argue. I took a breath, the weight of years pressing against my ribs, and let the words fall like steel into the quiet. Family isn't blood. Family is how you treat each other. I looked at my father, and you treated me like I was nothing. I turned to my mother. You stood by and let him. My gaze landed on Sophia, her shoulders shaking with the effort to hold herself together, and you enjoyed every moment of my absence. Finally, I swept my eyes across the whole room, letting the truth settle where it belonged. So don't come into my home and tell me what I owe. You cut me out of your family. Don't expect me to forget that now. The room seemed to freeze in that moment, as if the walls themselves held their breath. No one spoke, no one moved. The weight of my words hung between us, undeniable and final. I rose from my chair slowly, the leather creaking beneath me as I stood. My pulse was calm now, no longer racing, my voice even and steady. If you came here for money, I said, looking each of them in the eye, you've knocked on the wrong door. The words fell heavy, and for a moment no one dared move. Robert, once the man whose word was law in our household, lowered his head. The sharpness in his posture melted into defeat, and the authority he carried his whole life slipped away in silence. Sophia turned quickly, her carefully made-up face tightening as shame spread across it, her jaw clenched in anger she couldn't release. Elaine broke softly, tears streaming down her cheeks, but still she rose and followed Robert, her purse clutched to her chest like a lifeline. Ethan, who had puffed himself up so arrogantly when he walked in now, sat stiff and silent, avoiding my gaze, his tie suddenly too tight for his throat. I guided them toward the door, my footsteps steady on the walnut floors. The air outside burst into brightness as I opened it, the harsh Texas sun spilling across their faces. They stepped out into the heat shadows stretching long across the driveway as they walked toward their cars. Not a word was exchanged. Only the shuffle of their shoes on the stone path and the muted slam of car doors broke the silence. I stood there a moment longer, my hand resting on the polished brass handle, watching them disappear down the long, private road that wound through the gates. Then I closed the door behind them. The heavy click echoed through the house like a final punctuation, sharp and irrevocable. It sounded like the end of 12 years of silence, rejection, and waiting. The house was still again. I leaned against the door, let my shoulders drop, and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time in years, the weight pressing down on me seemed to lift, replaced by something quieter, steadier. Release. That night, the mansion wasn't silent. It was alive with voices I trusted. Colleen sat at one end of the long oak table, Marcus at the other. Rachel and a handful of my colleagues scattered in between. Plates of barbecue and bowls of salad filled the table, glasses clinked, laughter rolled through the air. This was my family now. The people who had stood beside me when no one else would, who had built something with me from nothing but grit and hope. Colleen raised her glass, grinning. "To making our own tables," she said, and everyone laughed, lifting their drinks. Rachel leaned closer to me after a while, her voice low but full of warmth. "That hospital wouldn't exist without you. There are children alive because you cared enough to fight for them. Don't ever forget that." Later, as the night wound down and the dishes were cleared, my phone buzzed quietly on the counter. A message flashed across the screen. It was from Lucas, my nephew, the one who had grown up hearing only his mother's version of me. The text was simple. "Thank you for trying. I know what you did. I'll never forget it." My throat tightened, my chest swelling with something unexpected. It wasn't reconciliation, not fully, but it was a crack of light in the wall they had built around me. When the guests left and the house fell into its midnight hush, I walked into my study. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over a spread of blueprints. I pulled one closer. A design for a community center. I'd been dreaming of a place for the children of working-class families to read, to draw, to dream the way I once had in secret. A place where parents could learn skills to change their futures. I picked up my pencil, tracing lines across the paper, the soft scratch filling the silence. My hands, once blistered and raw from carrying bricks, now shaped futures with steady precision. Outside the tall windows, the city pulsed with light, but here in my study there was only the quiet rhythm of creation. A door had closed that day, sealed for good, but another had swung wide open, one I had built myself. If this story spoke to you, stay with me. There are more journeys like mine. Stories of betrayal, of justice, of rising from the ashes to reclaim your own power. I invite you to follow along because together we'll keep telling the truths that others tried to silence.